one letter, one woman, and one moment that changed everything. When King Charles was handed a sealed envelope marked private for his eyes only, he had no idea it would be the emotional trigger that exposed everything he feared. But once he opened it, there was no turning back. The throne itself would tremble under the weight of its words. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It arrived without ceremony, without announcement, and without a traceable path. No official seal. No recorded delivery. Just an envelope placed carefully into the king's private correspondence, separated from state papers and daily briefings, as if someone understood its danger. At first, Charles barely reacted. He assumed it was another private appeal, another carefully worded concern filtered through royal etiquette. But the handwriting stopped him. Familiar. Intimate. Unmistakably Catherine's. And in that instant, something inside him tightened, a quiet unease settling before a single word was read. As his eyes moved across the opening lines, confusion gave way to something darker. This was not polite. This was not cautious. This was raw. The words did not ask, they confronted. They did not flatter, they exposed. Catherine was not writing as a future queen or a public symbol. She was writing as a woman who had reached the end of her silence. Each sentence peeled back years of restraint, revealing a depth of pain Charles had never been forced to face so directly. The letter was written weeks before Catherine's sudden withdrawal from public life, long before the palace began offering rehearsed explanations and medical vagueness. This was a warning that arrived too late to stop what followed. Charles read on alone, deliberately isolated, choosing Balmoral for its distance and stillness. No advisors. No Camilla. No aides hovering nearby. Just a king, a chair by the window, and a truth he had unknowingly helped bury. With every paragraph, the weight grew heavier. Catherine spoke of moments when doors quietly closed, when support dissolved behind polite smiles, when her voice faded inside rooms where decisions were made without her. She did not accuse loudly. She didn't need to. The restraint made it worse. It made it undeniable. What shook Charles most was not anger but grief. The realization that this letter had not come through official channels meant someone powerful had intervened. A senior royal. A silent ally. Someone who believed the king needed to see this unfiltered, untouched, and unprotected by palace spin. As the final page slipped from his hands, the atmosphere around him changed. Staff were dismissed. Phones went unanswered. Instructions were issued quietly but firmly. No leaks, no movement, no discussion. The palace didn't announce a lockdown, but it happened all the same. A wall of silence descended, thick and deliberate. And there, in the stillness, Charles finally understood that this letter was not just personal. It was destabilizing. It challenged the version of events he had accepted, the harmony he believed existed, the balance he thought he had maintained. And as the weight of Catherine's words lingered in the room, one truth became unavoidable. This moment did not begin with the letter. It ended with it. But to understand why this one letter could unravel decades of royal silence, we must journey back to a time when Catherine was cornered and no one came to her aid. Behind every royal wave and public smile was a woman grappling with betrayal, isolation, and mounting pressure. Catherine, beloved by the nation, was quietly crumbling inside the palace walls, and no one saw it coming. Until now. It started with subtle shifts, moments too quiet for headlines but too sharp for those paying attention to miss. As King Charles began stepping back from the front lines, citing fatigue, the public noticed Catherine taking on more engagements. At first, it was admired her grace, her resilience, her unwavering poise. But the truth was far more troubling. These appearances weren't a mark of strength, they were a demand. A royal obligation forced upon a woman already burdened beyond measure. Behind closed doors, Catherine's world was shrinking, her voice fading into the background of an institution that had no room for fragility. Her smile became a shield, her silence a survival tactic. What seemed like confidence in the public eye was, in reality, carefully curated distance. Catherine's solo outings increased dramatically, often under the guise of duty, but whispers inside the palace painted another picture. Was it strategic distancing from the inner circle, or punishment disguised as independence? The narrative was controlled, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Even staff began to question the frequency of her assignments, especially those that placed her under grueling pressure without visible support. And behind every assignment was a question that grew louder in the silence. Where was Charles? At the heart of Catherine's unraveling was her health, an open secret managed with calculated discretion. Exhaustion, migraines, anxiety symptoms dismissed, hidden or spun into softer language. Yet her deterioration wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological, and much of it traced back to one name, Camilla. The tension between the Queen and the Princess of Wales had long been speculated, but within the palace it was more than rivalry, it was warfare without weapons. Sharp glances, strategic exclusions, deliberate dismissals. Camilla wielded silence like a dagger, and Catherine was bleeding behind closed doors. But what shook the foundations wasn't the conflict between the two women, it was the absence of protection from Charles. Publicly, he praised Catherine. Privately, he vanished into protocol, choosing comfort over confrontation. He watched the tension build and did nothing. He heard the whispers and changed the subject. In doing so, he became not just a bystander to her pain, but a quiet contributor to it. And so, Catherine turned elsewhere. In the quiet corners of royal residences, she found unexpected allies in Anne and Edward, meetings that were never officially logged, conversations that never made it to press. But within them, the spark of something real, understanding, solidarity, and perhaps, the beginning of a plan. They listened when no one else did. They saw what others refused to see. And it was in the echoes of those conversations that Catherine found her courage not to speak out, but to write. And as Catherine suffered in silence, she began writing, pouring her truths into a letter she never intended to send. Until she did. When King Charles finally dared to read the words penned by Catherine, he wasn't prepared for what they contained. Confessions, accusations, and an ultimatum. This wasn't just a letter, it was a warning. It began quietly, almost tenderly, with Catherine recounting the earliest days of her royal journey, how she entered the family with hope, reverence, and the belief that love could survive even in the coldest of institutions. But the tone quickly shifted. Her words turned sharp, layered with pain that had clearly gone unspoken for far too long. There was no anger in her handwriting, only devastation. She spoke of abandonment, not just in moments of crisis, but in the slow, suffocating indifference that had become Charles's legacy in her life. She wasn't merely writing to a king, she was confronting a man who had failed to shield her when the walls began to close in. Catherine did not tiptoe around her accusations. She named Camilla directly. She described the calculated manipulation, the subtle social exclusions, the withering judgment that came not in outbursts, but in carefully executed acts of erasure. Private engagements that were reassigned. Key decisions made without her input. Invitations that never arrived. Camilla had not simply rivaled her, she had attempted to redefine the monarchy around herself. And Charles had, in Catherine's words, allowed it to happen without resistance. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal from the queen consort. It was the quiet, passive consent from the man who should have been her greatest ally. And then came the turning point. Catherine recounted a single event, its details cloaked, yet the emotional wreckage it left was clear. A moment, she hinted, that broke something in her permanently. She didn't describe the setting, or who else was present, but the pain radiated through her choice of words. She called it the moment I ceased to matter, and the night silence became my only companion. Whatever occurred that night wasn't just an insult, it was a rupture that led directly to her withdrawal. And still, she received no apology, no gesture of acknowledgement, only more silence. But perhaps the most chilling part of the letter came when Catherine shifted focus to her children. She expressed a haunting fear not for herself, but for Charlotte. Her words painted a future where the same cold indifference, the same institutional blindness, would swallow her daughter whole. She warned that the monarchy was devouring its own, smiling on balconies while daughters watched their mothers disappear behind duty and denial. Charlotte, she feared, would inherit not just a title, but a legacy of emotional invisibility. Catherine's maternal instincts erupted from the page. protective and desperate, refusing to let history repeat itself. Laced between the emotional truths were quiet references to private conversations with Queen Elizabeth, hints that the late monarch had shared concerns, had warned Catherine about the price of survival within the firm. She didn't quote the Queen. She didn't need to. The implication was enough that Catherine wasn't simply fighting against her present, but honoring advice whispered by a woman who had once ruled the empire, and still understood its inner poisons. And in the final lines, Catherine wrote not with fury, but with clarity, a sorrow so deep it pierced through the page. But alongside that sorrow was something else, a veiled threat. Not violent, not crude, but unmistakably potent. A suggestion that silence would not protect them forever, that if ignored, the truth would not stay buried, that the next move, if needed, would not come through letters, but legacy. Her pain had reached its boiling point, and she had laid it bare, not to beg, but to warn. But what Charles didn't realize was that others had read parts of the letter before him, and one of them was already making moves behind the scenes. While Charles wept in private, others were quietly preparing for a different future. Princess Anne and Prince Edward, long sidelined, had seen the storm coming. And they weren't about to let it consume the crown. Long before the letter reached the king's trembling hands, whispers of unrest had already taken root behind palace walls. Anne, ever the sentinel of the monarchy's deeper pulse, had begun to sense the fractures no one else dared acknowledge. And Edward, calm, methodical, often underestimated, was listening closely. Together, they formed an unlikely alliance. Not born of ambition, but necessity. They weren't seeking power. They were seeking preservation, not of tradition, but of the soul of the institution itself. In hushed tones and quiet corridors, they began to plan. It started with questions. Why had Catherine suddenly withdrawn from key engagements without explanation? Why had Charles grown distant, distracted, and most troubling silent? Why was Camilla's influence expanding unchecked, casting shadows where light used to be? Anne, sharp and unyielding, didn't trust coincidence. She suspected a truth was being buried. And Edward, who had long kept himself outside the fray, stepped forward not with words, but with resolve. He demanded clarity. Anne demanded accountability. And together, they began making moves that weren't recorded in royal calendars or tracked by the press. Their meetings at Sandringham were intentionally discreet. No press releases. No official guests. Just two senior royals locked behind estate doors, poring over timelines, inconsistencies, and unspoken wounds. They didn't need the letter to know something was wrong, but they were beginning to suspect it existed. Someone had hinted. A staff member. A former aide. Perhaps even Catherine herself, in a moment of quiet desperation. It didn't matter how they knew it mattered that they did. And what they feared most wasn't its content. It was that the king might ignore it. Anne was livid not just at Charles, but at the creeping power Camilla was quietly amassing. Decisions once made by consensus were now being funneled through the Queen's circle. Appearances were shifting. Messaging was changing. And the woman who had once weathered storms with a silent grace, Catherine, was now nowhere to be found in the palace's narrative. Edward called it erosion. Anne called it sabotage. They both agreed it had to end. For the first time in decades, the younger generation of senior royals acted without deferring upward. Anne and Edward moved not with rebellion but with purpose. They drafted private memos, redirected staff, and reached out to individuals they knew would speak honestly, even if it meant breaking protocol. Quietly, they formed a protective perimeter around Catherine. Not physical, but institutional. A buffer. A message. She was not alone. And more importantly, she was not powerless. Their unspoken pact was simple: Catherine's place must be secured, even if that meant standing against their own brother. They didn't do it with malice, they did it with clarity. Because in Catherine, they saw the last thread of moral dignity the monarchy still had left. And they feared what would be lost if she slipped through the cracks, abandoned like so many before her. But even they couldn't predict what would happen next, when Catherine vanished from the public eye and the palace's official story began to unravel. No appearances, no statements, no photos. Catherine, once the shining face of the monarchy, vanished. But was it illness or exile? The truth may be more disturbing than anyone is prepared to admit. It began like a whisper, barely noticed at first, a missed engagement here, a cancelled appearance there. At first, the explanation was simple: rest. Then, quiet murmurs of illness, but nothing official. No diagnosis, no timeline, just vague acknowledgments that left more questions than answers. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into a troubling silence. The woman who once stood at the heart of royal representation was now a ghost. The palace's official narrative crumbled under its own weight as the public grew restless. And inside the palace walls, a much darker story was unfolding, one that those closest to the truth were desperate to keep hidden. Insiders began speaking carefully, choosing their words like soldiers in enemy territory. The narrative of a medical break no longer held. Whispers leaked of a confrontation, private, vicious, and final, between Catherine and Camilla. A clash that reportedly ended with raised voices and a line drawn in stone. What was said, no one could confirm. But it was enough to shatter the fragile tolerance that had existed between the two women. And after that night, Catherine was gone. Not relocated, not resting, vanished. Behind the scenes, strange movements began to catch attention. Princess Anne, known for her stoicism and distance from palace drama, was spotted twice leaving Catherine's private residence in the middle of the night. No security convoys. No official scheduling. Just Anne in silence, slipping through the side gates. Whatever occurred in those quiet hours was not logged, not leaked, and not acknowledged. But it signaled something deeper than concern. It signaled coordination. Online, the digital hunt intensified. Internet sleuths scoured archived flight logs, satellite images, and inconsistencies in royal schedules. One location kept surfacing, a remote estate rarely mentioned, tucked far from London, long associated with quiet retreats and classified meetings. Suddenly, that estate's staff activity surged. Deliveries increased, lights on at odd hours. Guards posted without explanation. And no one from the palace addressed it. They didn't deny it, they didn't confirm it. They simply pretended it didn't exist. As pressure mounted, the official story began to fray. Behind the polished statements, a more alarming theory took hold. Catherine hadn't stepped back. She had been moved, removed, protected, or silenced. Depending on whom you believed, it was either a desperate effort to shield her from spiraling media intrusion or a calculated strategy to keep her quiet before something bigger erupted. The distinction was crucial. And yet, no one could say for certain which version was real. That uncertainty was more dangerous than any single scandal. By now, public trust had begun to wobble. Commentators who once defended the palace began to question the growing information void. Protests, once unthinkable, emerged outside the gates. The public didn't just want answers, they demanded them. But all they received were pre-written statements, cold silence, and a deepening mystery that threatened to swallow the monarchy whole. For Charles, already unraveling in private, it was another weight on an already fractured crown. And as speculation grew, Camilla made a move no one expected, one that would ignite outrage and trigger a royal power play. With the public turning sympathetic to Catherine, Queen Camilla stepped into the spotlight, but not with compassion. She came armed with silence, symbolism, and something far more dangerous: control. At a time when the nation was demanding answers, Camilla gave them none. Instead, she offered a performance, a masterclass in quiet defiance. Gone were the soft, shared engagements. In their place came a series of solo appearances, each one more commanding than the last. She walked into events not as a consort standing beside the king, but as a monarch in her own right. Her posture, her presence, her silence all sharpened into a message. Catherine may be gone, but the throne remained steady, and it stood with her. But behind the controlled optics, insiders were watching something else unravel. Camilla wasn't filling a void. She was seizing it. One of the first signs was subtle, yet deliberate. A highly anticipated event, originally slated for Catherine, suddenly had a new guest of honor. Camilla arrived draped in confidence, smiling, delivering a speech that struck a chord, and not the kind meant to comfort. She spoke of resilience in adversity, of finding strength in solitude, and rising beyond shadows cast by others. The audience heard a speech. The palace heard a declaration. It wasn't just about Catherine. It was about reclaiming power, rewriting narrative, and silencing sympathy before it spiraled out of control. But Camilla didn't stop at words. At Clarence House, staff were quietly instructed to remove a specific portrait one of Diana. It had stood quietly in a side corridor for years, a quiet nod to memory. And now it was gone. No statement, no explanation. But its absence spoke volumes. Catherine's growing comparison to Diana, her silence, her suffering, her sudden disappearance was becoming too sharp, too dangerous. And Camilla, perhaps sensing history's echo, decided to preempt it, erase the symbol before it became prophecy. Behind closed doors, the Queen's grip tightened. According to sources within the palace, Charles, deep in emotional turmoil, requested to see Catherine. Not formally, not publicly, just as a man who needed to understand. Camilla intervened. The visit never happened. The excuse was phrased as timing. In truth, it was leverage. Charles was slipping, and Camilla knew it. The more isolated he became, the more power shifted toward her. But that power came at a cost. For the first time in recent memory, Charles and Camilla were seen leaving events in separate vehicles. Not once. Repeatedly. A small crack, perhaps. But in a family obsessed with optics, it was enough to raise alarms. Camilla had overplayed her hand. Instead of extinguishing the fire, she fanned it. Instead of silencing questions, she made them scream louder. The public no longer saw a united monarchy. They saw a fracture growing by the day. One side retreating into silence, the other pressing forward with icy resolve. And still, Catherine remained out of sight. No updates, no photographs, only speculation and rising unrest. But even Camilla couldn't hold back the tide when Catherine's allies stepped forward and released something that would set the palace on fire. Just when the palace thought the worst had passed, a leaked audio recording Catherine's voice, fragile yet firm, shook the monarchy again. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a royal indictment. The audio surfaced without warning. No watermark, no date stamp. Just a clipped, haunting file uploaded anonymously to a small digital forum, only to explode across the internet within hours. The voice was unmistakable. Calm, broken in places, but unmistakably Catherine. Not the carefully rehearsed voice of official engagements, but the raw tone of a woman finally breaking her silence. In under 4 minutes, she did what the palace had spent months trying to avoid. She told her truth. Not with rage, but with terrifying clarity. In the recording, Catherine spoke of being erased in plain sight, a phrase that ignited instant fury. She described how her presence had become a threat, how her role had been chipped away by forces inside the very institution she once believed would protect her. But it was her mention of invisible chains that stung the most. She wasn't just talking about royal duty, she was talking about control, about being cornered behind smiling photos and protocol while privately struggling to breathe, about being silenced not through orders, but through neglect. It was not a resignation, it was an accusation. But it was her children, especially Charlotte, who she circled back to again and again. Her voice faltered slightly when she spoke of legacy, of what kind of world her daughter would inherit if the current system continued unchallenged. She warned of a future where daughters are raised to disappear beautifully. It wasn't an abstract warning, it was a direct strike against everything the monarchy was projecting to the world. It was deeply personal, and it was devastating. The most controversial moment came near the end, where Catherine alluded to betrayal. She never named names. She didn't have to. The tone of heartbreak, of disbelief, hung heavy as she described someone who once called me family, choosing loyalty to the crown over loyalty to truth. The recording was short, but it was seismic. In under 5 minutes, Catherine shattered the palace's carefully constructed illusion, and the public responded in kind. Within hours, the audio trended across every major platform. Hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Hashtag where is Catherine? Hashtag hear her voice. Hashtag Charlotte deserves better. Crowds formed outside palace gates, not just in London, but in cities far beyond. Protesters held up images of Diana and Catherine side by side, drawing parallels the firm could no longer ignore. Statements from royal representatives were delayed. When they arrived, they were weak, vague, and instantly picked apart. The monarchy, once built on silence, was now being dismantled by a single voice the world wasn't supposed to hear. Inside the palace, chaos turned to crisis. Reports from insiders revealed that upon hearing the audio for the first time, King Charles collapsed. Not figuratively, literally. Staff claimed he dropped to his knees, shaking, unable to process the weight of Catherine's words. It was his second emotional break in weeks. This time, there were no comforting arms, no public shows of unity. Just a king haunted by a voice he had failed to hear until it was too late. But in the shadows of scandal, a forgotten voice rose from history, revealing that Queen Elizabeth had left behind her own message. For Charles alone. As Charles spiraled emotionally, palace archivists uncovered something sealed with the late Queen Elizabeth's personal crest. A final note, a final wish, and within it, a shocking instruction about Catherine. It was discovered by accident, or perhaps fate. In the quiet aftermath of chaos, a senior archivist tasked with organizing the Queen's personal documents uncovered a slender envelope tucked deep within the drawers of her private writing desk at Windsor. There was no protocol for it, no record. Only an inscription written in Queen Elizabeth's unmistakable steady hand, "For my son." It was dated shortly before her passing. The discovery was taken directly to Charles without detour, without delay. And when he opened it, the room reportedly fell still. The Queen's words were deliberate, purposeful, and carried the full weight of a monarch who had seen the consequences of silence, tradition, and neglect. It wasn't a mother's farewell. It was a ruler's final directive. She didn't mention titles, or duty, or even the crown. She spoke of Catherine, not as a daughter-in-law but as a keystone to the monarchy's future. Safeguard her, she wrote, no matter the cost. Elizabeth called her a pillar the future must rest on, a phrase that cut through Charles like thunder. She didn't ask, she instructed. The Queen, in her final note, had made it unmistakably clear Catherine was not to be lost. Not again. Not like Diana. But it was what followed that left Charles undone. Elizabeth warned against repeating the sins of the past. The line was underlined. She didn't name Diana, but her shadow loomed across every word. The unspoken comparison between the two women abandoned by the system, isolated by the crown, was glaring. The Queen's acknowledgement was both a confession and a caution. She had seen what silence had cost the monarchy once. She would not allow it to happen again. Her legacy demanded something better. Her son's reign depended on it. Staff members later described Charles as frozen, barely able to breathe. The letter shook him more deeply than Catherine's. This was his mother, his monarch, his conscience in ink. And when he finally rose from his chair, he was visibly trembling, his face pale, his voice hoarse. He held the letter as if it were sacred, because to him, it was. The message didn't just reopen wounds. It forced him to confront what he had allowed, what he had ignored, and what he had failed to protect. This wasn't just about Catherine anymore. It was about legacy, lineage, and the weight of generational failure. The Queen's final note was a mirror. And what Charles saw in it was a reflection of everything he had hoped to escape, but now had no choice but to face. He could no longer claim ignorance. He could no longer claim helplessness. Elizabeth had given him one last command. And this time, he would have to obey not as king, but as her son. And with his mother's words echoing in his heart and Catherine's pain burning in his mind, King Charles did the unthinkable. They said he wouldn't act, that he couldn't. But in a move that shocked even his closest advisors, King Charles broke protocol and perhaps the monarchy's unspoken rules to do one final thing: apologize. It was quiet. No entourage. No public notice. Just a single black car slipping past the gates of Windsor in the early morning hours. The man who had once been groomed to reign in silence was now walking alone, carrying a bouquet of white flowers in trembling hands. He placed them gently outside the residence where Catherine had once smiled to the world, and now, behind closed doors, remained unseen by it. Cameras weren't invited, but they came anyway. And what they captured was not a monarch. It was a father. A man. Broken. Exposed. And, at last, accountable. The symbolism wasn't missed. This was not a palace directive. This was not an act of optics. This was personal. And yet, it rippled with political consequence. Because behind that gesture came another. A quiet request made not through advisors, but directly to meet with William and Charlotte. The meeting, held privately, was said to be deeply emotional. No royal language, no handlers, just three people, bound by love and by pain, confronting a silence that had stretched too far for too long. For William, it was the apology he had waited for. For Charlotte, it was the beginning of something new. And for Charles, it was a reckoning. But the gesture that followed stunned the palace. Charles sat alone that night and wrote. Not a speech. Not a press release. A letter. Handwritten. Addressed to Catherine. No one but the courier who delivered it and the woman who received it knows what it contained. There was no public statement, no palace confirmation. But what insiders revealed was that Catherine did receive it, and did read it. Whether she responded remains unknown, but what is certain is this: it changed something. Not just in her, in him. In the days that followed, Camilla's absence became conspicuous. 3 major royal events and no sign of the queen consort. No statements, no substitutes, just silence. Some claimed she was unwell. Others suggested she was removed, quietly and without confrontation. The truth, as always, was buried beneath layers of protocol. But something had shifted, and Charles, according to those closest to him, was no longer the man he had been. He kept his schedule, but with none of the practiced charm. He spoke less, observed more, and, in moments when he thought no one was watching, appeared utterly hollow. The cost of change had been steep. He had lost control, lost face, perhaps even lost trust. But for the first time in his reign, he had done something real, something human. He had broken the monarchy's most sacred rule not to reveal the heart. And in doing so, he had begun to rebuild it. Not with power, with penance. And though the letter began as Catherine's private plea, it became the catalyst for a silent revolution, one still rippling through the walls of the monarchy. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.